My name is Ren, and I was standing at the head table in my wedding dress when my stepfather grabbed the microphone out of my hand and told 300 people he was leaving my mother on the happiest night of my life. I need to take you back 6 months before that microphone ever left my hand, because what happened that night wasn't an explosion. It was a fuse that had been lit a long time ago, and I just happened to be standing at the altar when it finally reached the end. I'm a wedding and event planner by trade, which, if you know anything about irony, you already understand was either the worst possible job to have walking into my own wedding, or the only reason I survived it with my dignity intact. 8 years in the business. I've watched fathers cry doing the right thing and mothers ruin perfectly good receptions trying to be the center of someone else's day. I thought I'd seen every version of family chaos a banquet hall could produce. I had not yet seen my own. My fiancé is named Callum. He's an architect, methodical, calm in the specific way that comes from spending your whole career making sure buildings don't fall down. We'd been together 4 years. He proposed at the restaurant where we had our first terrible date, the one where the waiter dropped a tray of drinks on my dress, and Callum laughed so hard he had to apologize to the entire room. I said yes before he finished the sentence. My mother is Denise. My stepfather is Garrett. They married when I was 16, 11 years before my wedding, after my biological father, a man named Theo, who I'll get to, left when I was 9 and mostly disappeared from my life for the better part of 2 decades. Garrett was, on paper, the good one. Steady job in commercial insurance, paid the mortgage, showed up to my high school graduation in a tie he clearly hated wearing. For years I told people I was lucky. A lot of kids get a stepfather who resents them. I got one who came to my dance recitals and pretended to enjoy them. What I didn't see, what I was 11 years too close to see, was that Garrett's steadiness wasn't kindness. It was control wearing a cardigan. He decided what restaurants we went to. He decided when conversations were over. He decided, increasingly over the years, what my mother was allowed to want. I noticed it in small ways long before the wedding. My mother used to paint. Not professionally, just watercolors on Sunday afternoons, casual and happy, brushes drying on the windowsill. Sometime around when I was 20, the easel disappeared from the sunroom. When I asked her about it, she said Garrett thought the smell of the paints was giving him headaches. She said it lightly, like it was nothing. I let it be nothing. The way you let a lot of things be nothing when you're 20 and building your own life and don't want to look too hard at the cracks in someone else's. I want to be honest about something. I didn't see the divorce coming. Nobody did. That's important because what Garrett did at my wedding wasn't really about the divorce at all. The divorce was real, I'd find that out, but the timing, the stage, the microphone in my hand, that was never about my mother. That was about Garrett needing an audience for the worst moment of his life, and deciding my wedding was the biggest audience he was ever going to get. The wedding planning itself, ironically, went almost too smoothly. I run weddings for a living, so I ran mine like a military operation with better lighting. Callum's parents, Diane and Paul, were warm and easy, the kind of in-laws other people complain about not having. Diane cried happy touching my veil at the final dress fitting. Paul, the bride's father in every sense that would end up mattering that night, was quiet, watchful, and I'd learn paying far closer attention to my family than I ever gave him credit for. The only friction in 6 months of planning came from Garrett, and it came disguised as generosity. I'd like to say a few words at the reception, he told me over dinner 4 months out. As your father. I didn't correct him on the word. I probably should have. Theo, my actual father, had re-entered my life 2 years earlier, slowly, carefully, the way you'd approach a structure you weren't sure was still standing. He'd asked for nothing. He showed up to my engagement dinner with a bottle of wine and spent the whole night listening more than talking, like he was trying to make up for 2 decades of silence by finally using his ears. I'd invited him to walk me down the aisle. Garrett knew this. I'd told him myself, gently, months before. He'd nodded and said, "Of course, makes sense," in a tone so flat I should have heard the crack underneath it. Sure, I told him about the toast. Keep it short and sweet. He smiled. Short and sweet, he repeated, like he was trying the words on. I didn't know yet that he meant something entirely different by short. 3 weeks before the wedding, my Other called me crying. Not the performative crying I'd later watch Garrett's family produce on command. Actual, quiet, exhausted crying, the kind that comes out sideways because you've been holding it in too long. He wants a separation, she said. He told me this morning over coffee like he was telling me we were out of milk. I sat on my kitchen floor and listened to my mother's voice break apart in real time, 3 weeks before I was supposed to walk down an aisle, and I felt something in me go very still and very clear. The same stillness I get on event day when a vendor cancels 2 hours before doors open. Crisis mode. Solve, don't spiral. Do you want him at the wedding? I asked her. He's still your stepfather, she said. I don't want to make your day about us. That sentence would come back to haunt both of us, because Garrett was about to make the day about nothing but himself, and my mother's instinct to protect me from her own pain was the exact opening he needed. I should have uninvited him right there. I think some part of me knew that. But weddings have momentum, the way trains have momentum, and I told myself 11 years of him showing up to dance recitals had to count for something. I told my mother we'd get through it together, one night, and then she could fall apart properly afterward, with me right beside her instead of standing at a podium in white. I had no idea I was negotiating with a man already counting down to his own performance. The week of the wedding, small things started arriving that I filed away without understanding yet. Garrett asked the DJ, unprompted, what time the toasts were scheduled, and specifically what time his toast was scheduled as if there were others competing for the slot. He asked twice. The DJ, a guy named Marcus I'd worked with on a dozen events, mentioned it to me almost as a joke. Your stepdad's very invested in his timing, he said. I laughed it off. I had 300 place settings to confirm, and a florist threatening to substitute peonies for ranunculus. I did not have room in my head for Garrett's timing. My mother, meanwhile, was doing something I didn't fully appreciate until much later. She was quietly, carefully, making sure the day stayed mine. She met with the venue coordinator behind my back to confirm the seating chart kept Garrett at a distance from where Theo would be sitting. She told Diane and Paul gently, over a planning lunch, that there was some family tension they should be aware of without making it their problem. She was running her own kind of crisis management, 3 weeks into the worst betrayal of her marriage, because some habits, the habit of protecting your child even while your own life is collapsing, don't switch off just because you're exhausted. I didn't know about most of this until afterward. I only knew, walking into my wedding day, that something in the air felt like a held breath. The ceremony itself was, against every odd, beautiful. Theo walked me down the aisle in a navy suit that didn't quite fit him right, his hand shaking slightly on my arm, and when he lifted my veil at the end he didn't say anything. He just pressed his lips together and nodded, like a man finally getting to finish a sentence he'd started 20 years earlier. Callum cried before I even finished my vows. Diane sobbed loud enough that the officiant paused and smiled at her. My mother sat in the front row in pale blue, dabbing her eyes, and if you didn't know what I knew, you'd have thought those were only happy tears. Garrett sat 3 rows back. I noticed it distantly, the way you notice weather. I didn't think about what it meant that a man who'd raised me for 11 years had quietly demoted himself to the 3rd row of his own stepdaughter's wedding. I think now that he noticed it too, and that it mattered to him more than it should have, and that by the time the reception started, something in him had decided the 3rd row wasn't where he intended to stay for the rest of the night. The reception was at a restored barn an hour outside the city, string lights threaded through exposed beams, 280 guests at long farmhouse tables, the kind of warm low light that makes every photo look like a painting. I'd planned every minute of it. Cocktail hour, dinner service, first dance, toasts. I had a literal printed schedule laminated in the DJ's booth. Best man at 8:15. Maid of honor at 8:25. Parents, plural, intentionally vague, because I genuinely hadn't decided in what order or whether Garrett's toast and my mother's toast would even be separate, sometime after that. What I hadn't put on the schedule, because I had no way to know it was coming, was a 3rd father figure standing up uninvited with something that was about to detonate the entire night. Callum's best man, a college roommate named Soren, gave a toast that made the whole room laugh and then, in the last 30 seconds, made half of them cry, th. Good kind of toast, the kind that's actually about the person it's for. My maid of honor, my friend Priya, followed with something warmer and funnier still, ending with a line about how she'd never seen me plan anything as well as I'd apparently planned falling in love, which got the whole barn laughing. Then Garrett stood up. He didn't ask. He didn't catch my eye first, the way every other speaker had. He just rose from his seat at table 2, walked to the small raised platform where the microphone stand was, and reached for the mic that was still warm in my hand, because I'd been about to introduce my mother's toast, the one she and I had quietly agreed she'd give alone, short and steady, the way she wanted it. "I think it's my turn," he said, and there was a smile on his face that I'd seen exactly once before, the night the easel disappeared from the sunroom, pleasant on the surface, and underneath it, something that wanted to be watched. I let go of the microphone because I genuinely thought, for 1/2 second, that he was about to say something kind. 11 years, dance recitals, the tie at graduation. I gave him the benefit of every doubt I had left in me. "I want to say congratulations to Ren and Callum," he started, and the room settled, warm, expectant. "Marriage is a beautiful thing. I should know, I've had a front row seat to one for 11 years. A few people laughed, unsure, the way you laugh at a joke you haven't fully parsed yet. "Which is why," he continued, and his voice changed register, dropped into something performative and wounded at once. "I think it's only fair, on a night about honesty and commitment, that I be honest too. Denise and I are getting divorced." The barn went silent in the specific way 300 people go silent when they collectively realize they're watching something that was never meant to be public. I heard a fork hit a plate somewhere near the back. I heard Diane's sharp intake of breath 2 seats down from me. I did not hear my own heartbeat, because for one stretched-out second, I genuinely could not feel it. "I didn't want to make this day about that," Garrett went on, which was, I would think later, one of the most dishonest sentences I have ever heard a human being say out loud while actively making the day about exactly that. "But I also didn't want to stand up here and pretend everything's fine, because I think Ren deserves a father figure who tells her the truth, even when it's hard." He looked at me when he said father figure, and I understood in that exact moment, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that this had never been about my mother's pain at all. This was about Theo sitting at table 1 in his ill-fitting navy suit. This was about the 3rd row. This was a man who had spent 11 years being the reliable one, the dependable one, the one who showed up, and who could not stand, even for one night, to watch someone else get credit for being my father. My mother had gone the color of the tablecloth. She wasn't crying. She was doing the thing I'd later recognize from a dozen of the family stories I'd absorbed over the years of doing this job. She'd gone completely, terribly still, the way people go still when they're doing fast, silent math on exactly how much worse this is about to get. I want to tell you I had a perfect, composed response ready. I didn't. For about 4 full seconds, I stood there in my wedding dress with my hands loose at my sides and felt 300 faces waiting to see what I'd do, and I had absolutely nothing. That's when Paul stood up. Callum's father, quiet Paul, watchful Paul, the man who'd spent 6 months of wedding planning saying almost nothing and noticing, apparently, everything, rose from his seat at the head table with a second cordless microphone in his hand. I hadn't even known there was a second microphone live in the room. I'd find out later he'd quietly asked the DJ for one 2 hours earlier, just in case, with no further explanation, and Marcus, bless him, had handed it over without question, because that's the kind of trust Paul inspires in a room within about 10 minutes of meeting him. "I'm going to ask everyone's patience for 1 more minute," Paul said, and his voice was calm in a way that cut through the room more effectively than shouting ever could have. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. I've known Ren for about a year, since my son brought her home for the first time. In that year, I've learned exactly one thing about weddings that I think is worth saying out loud tonight. He let the silence sit for a second, the kind of pause a man only takes when he knows exactly what he's about to say, and has decided to say it slowly on purpose. A wedding belongs to the 2 people getting married, not to the people who want to use it as a stage. He didn't look at Garrett when he said it. He didn't need to. Every head in the barn had already swiveled. "Garrett," Paul continued, and his tone stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. "I'm sorry about your marriage, I mean that. Divorce is one of the hardest things 2 people go through, and if it's happening to you and Denise, I'm genuinely sorry. but you just stood at your stepdaughter's wedding, took the microphone out of her hand mid-toast, and announced your own personal crisis to a room full of people who came here to celebrate her. That's not honesty. That's theft. You stole 30 seconds of the only night this woman will ever have like this, and you spent it on yourself. A woman near the back of the barn, I'd learn later it was Diane's sister, actually said, "Thank you" out loud, quiet but clearly audible, the way you do when someone finally names the thing everyone in the room already felt. Garrett's face did something complicated. He was a man who had built an entire identity around being the reasonable one, the steady one, the one who never raised his voice. And he was being told, calmly, by another father, in front of everyone whose opinion he'd ever quietly curated, that his steadiness had just curdled into something selfish in real time, on camera, with 280 witnesses and a wedding photographer who, I'd discover, had not stopped shooting through any of it. "I was being honest," Garrett said, and his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. "I don't think that's a crime." "It's not a crime," Paul agreed easily. "It's just not your night." He set the microphone down on the table, unhurried, the way a man does when he's finished saying exactly what needed saying and has no further interest in extending the moment. Then he looked at me, not at Garrett, not at the room, just at me, and said simply, "Ren, I think it's still your turn." I have replayed that handoff in my head more times than I can count, not because of what Paul said, though that mattered enormously, because of what he did with it afterward, which was nothing. He didn't milk it. He didn't bask in the room's gratitude or wait for applause. He just sat back down, picked his fork back up, and resumed eating his dinner like a man who'd politely asked someone to lower their voice in a movie theater. The completeness of his calm did more damage to Garrett's performance than any amount of shouting could have, because it told the entire room, without a single extra word, "This isn't even a big deal to me. It's just obviously true." I picked up the microphone Garrett had abandoned on the platform. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised me more than anything else that night. 8 years of running other people's weddings had apparently trained something in me that didn't fully understand panic anymore, or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe I just wasn't going to let this be the version of my wedding that anyone remembered. "I'm not going to talk about the divorce," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "That's between my mother and Garrett, and it deserves a much smaller room than this one." A few people laughed, soft and relieved, the kind of laugh that releases tension rather than building it. "What I am going to talk about," I continued, "is the fact that I am standing in front of 280 people who love me, married to a man who has never once needed an audience to be kind to me, surrounded by a family. And I mean that in the broadest sense, the kind you build instead of just the kind you're born into, that showed up tonight to celebrate something good. I'd like to get back to that if everyone's willing." I turned deliberately to my mother. She was still pale, still rigid, her hands clasped so tight in her lap her knuckles had gone white. I held the microphone out toward her, not as a demand, just an offer. "Mom," I said, "you don't have to say anything tonight if you don't want to, but if you do, I'd love to hear it, on your own terms, not his." The room held its breath again, a different kind of held breath this time, not dread, but something closer to hope. My mother stood up slowly. She smoothed her pale blue dress with both hands, a habit I recognized from every nervous moment of my childhood, and she took the microphone from me with a grip that was steadier than I expected. "I had a toast prepared," she said, and her voice wobbled on the first few words before settling, the way an engine catches after a cold morning. It was about Ren as a little girl, and how she used to plan elaborate birthday parties for her stuffed animals when she was 6, complete with seating charts, which I suppose explains a few things about her career choice. Soft laughter rippled through the tables, grateful for somewhere safe to land. "I'm not going to give that toast exactly as written," she continued, "because some things happened tonight that I didn't expect, and I think pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But I will say this. S." He looked very deliberately, not at Garrett but at me. "My daughter has spent her whole adult life making other people's worst days into their best ones. She does this for strangers, for a living, with more patience and grace than I think most people are even capable of. Tonight, I watched her do it for free, in her own wedding dress, 30 seconds after someone tried to take the night away from her." Her voice cracked slightly on the last few words, but she didn't stop. Ren, I am so unbelievably proud of the woman you've become, and so grateful that whatever else has happened tonight, none of it changed who you are. To Ren and Callum. The toast that followed, glasses raised. A genuine swell of warmth moving back through the room like a tide coming back in, did more to restore the night than I think anyone, including me, believed possible 4 minutes earlier. I want to tell you, Garrett slunk quietly back to his seat, and the night moved on cleanly. It didn't, not entirely. He sat through the rest of dinner with the rigid posture of a man absorbing a public defeat he hadn't planned for, occasionally pulling out his phone, occasionally being approached by relatives offering the kind of strained, sympathetic small talk people give you when they don't quite know whether to comfort you or quietly judge you. I caught him, once, near the bar, telling his sister in a low voice that nobody understood the pressure he'd been under. And I let it go past me without engaging, because engaging would have given him exactly the audience he'd come for in the first place. And I had decided, somewhere between the microphone leaving my hand and Paul's voice cutting through the silence, that Garrett did not get to be the main character of my wedding twice in one night. Theo found me near the edge of the dance floor about an hour later, during a lull when Callum was off taking photos with his cousins. He didn't say much. He's not a man of many words, even now, 2 years into trying to rebuild something he broke 20 years earlier, but he put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "You handled that better than I would have at twice your age." I told him I learned composure from running other people's chaos for a living. He smiled and said maybe it was something else too, something he didn't get to take credit for but was glad to see anyway. I didn't ask him to clarify. I think we both knew what he meant. Paul and I didn't speak about it directly until the next morning, at the small family brunch the day after, when most of the wedding party had scattered back to their normal lives, and it was just close family lingering over coffee in Diane and Paul's sunroom. I thanked him. He waved it off, the way he waves off most compliments, but he did say one thing that stayed with me since. "I've been to a lot of weddings where someone tries to make it about themselves," he said, stirring his coffee slowly. "Usually it's smaller than that, a toast that runs too long, somebody getting drunk and making a scene. I've just never seen anyone try to weaponize their own divorce as a microphone grab before. Took some nerve. Wrong kind of nerve, but nerve." The aftermath unfolded the way these things usually do, slower than the drama itself. Quieter, mostly made of paperwork and awkward family dinners, rather than any further fireworks. My mother filed for divorce 2 weeks later, on terms that turned out to be far more in her favor than Garrett expected, partly because, and this still makes me laugh in the bitter way you laugh at things that are also genuinely funny, his outburst at my wedding had been captured in full, start to finish, by my own wedding photographer, on video with timestamp, in front of nearly 300 witnesses, which made it considerably harder for him to later claim, as he apparently tried to, that my mother had been difficult and unstable throughout their marriage. A man does not announce his own infidelity-adjacent divorce drama at his stepdaughter's wedding reception, and then successfully paint himself as the stable, wronged party in a courtroom 6 months later. The footage simply didn't support the narrative he wanted to build, and his lawyer, I'm told, eventually advised him to settle rather than let any of it get introduced as evidence of character. My mother got the house. She got, more importantly, her sunroom back, and within a year, an easel was back by the window, watercolors drying on the sill on Sunday afternoons, like a decade-long held breath had finally been let out. Garrett moved across town. I see him maybe twice a year now, at the kind of extended family gatherings too large to reasonably exclude anyone from, and we are civil in the particular careful way people are civil when there's a story everyone in the room remembers, but nobody brings up out loud. He has, as far as I know, never apologized, not to my mother, and not to me. I've made peace with that. Some people give you an apology eventually, once enough time has passed that it costs them less. Garrett, I think, is the kind of person who needs an audience even for his regrets, and he hasn't found one willing to listen yet. Theo walked me down the aisle that day, and he's been a steady, quiet presence in my life ever since, not trying to make up for 2 decades in one grand gesture, just showing up, consistently, in the small undramatic ways that actually count. We have dinner most Sundays now. He still doesn't say much. I've learned that's not the same thing as not caring. Callum and I are coming up on our 2nd anniversary. He still tells the story of our wedding the way most happy couples tell wedding stories, the flowers, the vows, his mother crying through the whole ceremony, and only mentions the toast incident when someone specifically asks, usually with the same slightly bemused, slightly proud tone people use when describing something that could have ruined the day and somehow didn't. I think about Paul's calm voice often, the way he didn't raise it, the way he simply named the thing and sat back down. I've used some version of his approach more than once in my work since clients whose families try to hijack the spotlight, relatives who think a wedding reception is an appropriate venue for unrelated grievances. I've learned that the loudest, most effective thing you can say to someone trying to make your worst moment into their stage is something close to what Paul said. That's not your night. No anger required. Just the truth, stated plainly, and the willingness to hand the microphone back to the person it actually belongs to. That's my story. One stolen toast, one borrowed microphone, and a father-in-law who understood, better than my own stepfather ever did, that the kindest thing you can do at someone's wedding is make sure it stays theirs. If someone in your life has ever tried to turn your biggest moment into their stage, I hope you find your own Paul, someone willing to quietly hand you the microphone back. Drop a comment if this one hit home, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.